Hello and welcome to the first of this Doctoral Consortium series on AI Spring. Let me simply say a few words about the Doctoral Consortium first of all. The Doctoral Consortium was an idea I had last year and the idea is that we, instead of having individual professors and individual classrooms talking to a small group of students, we can all join each other online and share resources. We can bring in the best professors in the world and we can have a kind of debate, a totally global debate about ideas that on occasions amounts to a kind of form of global brain. The kind of intensity of these discussions really is quite extraordinary. In the past, the Florida International University, FIU, Doctoral Design Program has hosted several other programs. We had one on architecture and philosophy and one on architecture, AI, neuroscience and architecture that was incredibly successful. Tongji University has also hosted the Doctoral Consortium, and the next few weeks we'll be branching out and having versions of the Doctoral Consortium in our various languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Farsi, Arabic, and so on, so that we will be sharing this knowledge around the world. So today then, this is something I find incredibly exciting. This is a moment, I think, which in my entire career, the most exciting moment, when all of a sudden we have a series of things happening. The development of a set of tools that are really revolutionizing the world of architectural design, that are changing things completely. And also, I would say, a set of ideas, theoretical ideas, that are informing this production that are quite extraordinary. If anything, the closest I can think of is the world of decon that emerged in the late 80s, early 90s, where the debates of philosophers such as Jacques Derrida and Deleuze and so on began to inform a revolutionary new approach towards architecture. In many ways, what we're seeing is a kind of echo of that, but something even more, I think, deep-rooted, something that I think is going to have a much more radical impact on the world of architecture than even the digital revolution itself has. So this is a series of sessions which will be going on over the next few weeks, and I hope you enjoy it. Let me first, before I actually start, although mention briefly that we have a call for submissions in Digital Futures, which for a session on DALLE, MidJourney. We put down Dream Studio, but it could be any of these diffusion platforms. We had a session a few weeks ago that is one of our most popular sessions ever. It's clear that this subject is firing up the imagination, especially of the young students. And I really look forward to seeing this session because I think it could be really remarkable. So please submit your forms. This particular session then is the first in a series of sessions on what I'm calling the AI Spring. In effect, there are two sessions together. Maybe if I can just show you this on this side here, you can see the colors here. At the top, we have a series of sessions looking at the impact of these new diffusion platforms on architecture and architectural culture. We will have a couple of sessions, one looking at the impact on the design studio. And I look forward to hearing how those who've been teaching the design studio, experimenting with this with their students, what sort of feedback they have. We have one on the future of the architectural office, which I think will be really quite important. And I also want to draw attention to Memo Acton, who is, I think, one of the most talented individuals in the world today. Both are kind of a computer scientist and also in many ways a polymath, a philosopher, and so on. And next week, I will be talking about why I'm calling this the AI Spring more precisely. There is a break for Acadia, and then we have 4 more sessions looking at the books that have been published in the last few months. 2022, I'm claiming, is the AI Spring, the moment when architects wake up to the possibility of AI. And this is you can see this both through the kind of the use of these platforms and also by the publications of these books. Let me simply kind of say at the bottom here, if anyone wants to go and join on the Zoom session, there's a link there where you can request the opportunity. The daylight savings always mess up things during the course of the year. I think Europe starts 1 week earlier than the States, and then China doesn't have any daylight savings. So the times do change over the course of the year. I think from November the 6th onwards, it's going to be at 11 o'clock p.m. in China, and it's also going to be a bit slightly different on the week before that because in Europe. So I'm looking forward to this. We have, I think, these books are really changing the way in which we're thinking about things, and to be able to go an overview of these books, I think will help in many ways. The relationship between the platforms and the books is also, I think, very interesting. On the one hand, those who published the books, as myself, in the last few months, will begin to realize that actually we're now getting the kind of visual material that we really needed beforehand, and lots of it. So in many ways, the books in terms of illustrations are a bit, let's say, outdated. But I think the important thing is that now that architects are waking up to the possibility of AI precisely because of these platforms. It's as though architects are always privileged in the visual, always aware of the appearance of things, and unless you can show evidence, visual evidence of it, then they're not going to be, no matter how much you write, there's not going to be very convincing. What's happening now, though, I think, is that people are really getting a glimpse of something, extraordinary. Now, all I would say is I think that what we're getting at the moment is simply we're looking at a sketching tool that is very interesting and very provocative, but down the line, there are changes in store that are going to be far more radical and far more deep-rooted. In the past, I've used the metaphor of the iceberg. You only see the top section of the iceberg, that 90% or so is below the water. I think that what we're going to discover is actually there are a number of tools which are currently under development that are going to radically change the nature of architecture in the next 3 to 5 years. I would predict that we're going to get platforms that are going to be able to operate from data to fabrication, and platforms also that are going to have built into them certain aspects like performance criteria. It'll automatically conform to structural concerns, to environmental concerns, and so on. It'll be have cost integrated into it, and we'll have a single seamless platform that won't have all these different modalities. For the moment, for example, at Zaha's office, they start with Maya, then they go into Rhino, then they go into BIM. I would predict we're going to have a single platform that's going to be very, very streamlined in the next few years. So what we're seeing, I think, is a glimpse of something which is maybe offering us some hint about how things are going to happen in the future. I will talk later about the shift from the image on the left-hand side, the first ever image, I think, that was generated of architecture, towards one on the right-hand side, one of many. Every time I go onto Instagram, I'm blown away by some of the projects that are on display there. And it's a shift that is, I think, happened very rapidly from 2019 until now, and it's going to change a lot further. So these are the books that we'll be talking about in the second part of the series. A whole slew of books, and of course these books took a long time in the making. They didn't appear overnight. Each book, I would say, takes at least 6 months to get a contract for. It takes a year at least to write, and often it takes up to a year to be produced. So in many ways, the authors of these books could foresee the significant changes that were going to happen, and they all came out, but with the exception of AI aesthetics that came up before, just in the last few months. It's as though this is the moment of awakening for architecture, both in terms of the tools and also in terms of the book. So these are the two themes that are going to run throughout this series. Today, I want to also add in another very topical issue, the question of whether AI can be consciousness. So I'm going to look at three different. The presentation today is going to be based on three different parts: a general introduction, an overview about what is AI, and not much more than that. Then a short discussion about the debate that went on this summer about whether AI could become conscious or not. And then I'm going to look at the whole process and track the development of the techniques for generating images using AI. So that's the plan. What is artificial intelligence? I know that many of you will know all about this topic, but many have actually come into AI through MidJourney, have recognized the extraordinary technique that they can use, but don't necessarily have much background in what is AI itself. It's a term that we all use. Excuse me. We all use the term, but not so many people really know what it means. And it reminds me in some ways of the way that the term 3D printing was being used a few years ago. Everyone was using the term and saying that it's cool, but actually those who've been working in 3D printing would know that actually there are certain challenges in terms of using 3D printing. It wasn't necessarily the answer to everything, and it was very expensive and slow and so on. AI is something I think that also I think needs to be sort of unpacked as a concept. So let me start then with a definition. A definition about what is AI, and this comes from Margaret Bowden, who wrote, I think, one of the most important books about AI on the right-hand side, and she is one of the kind of leading authorities in terms of the world of cognitive science. She set up the first department of cognitive science, the University of Sussex, many years ago. Andy Clark was one of the people that she employed there, and she was, in many ways, was a very far-sighted individual in seeing the possibility of this new domain. Having said that, I would say that maybe this particular definition is a little bit problematic. I have difficulty in understanding how you can say AI seeks to do something. It's a bit like saying architecture seeks to do something. We could say architects, perhaps, but so I'd say those working on AI, perhaps rather than AI, seek to make computers do the sort of things that minds can do. Well, is this correct? Well, firstly, we could point out that computers in some areas, in some discrete areas, and we can think here of games of chess and Go in particular, are much better than the human mind, much better and much quicker and so on. It's really a question of what the application is. In some areas, they're not so good. But I'd also challenge the idea that they necessarily have to do the kind of things that minds can do. Maybe they do different things and do different things better. And I think in particular, the question about consciousness, about whether indeed computers need to be conscious, I think is another question that needs to be addressed, and will be addressed in terms of this particular presentation. The standard perception that most people have of AI is that somehow it's something like a robot, and like Ava here from Ex Machina, as though AI equals robots. But that's not the case at all. Robots might be controlled by AI, but just as a Tesla car is in some senses controlled by AI, but it does not mean that a robot is AI. It's something, I would say, that's been inherited from the movie industry. So here we have a human actor who is playing at being a robot, and we also have robots that are playing at being human beings. This is Sophia, the humanoid robot developed by Hanson Electronics in Hong Kong, one that in many ways people somehow think is the embodiment of AI. They see a humanoid robot and they say AI, but that's not the case at all, I would say. I'm going to skip this a second. The view that's taken by many people is that actually this is completely bogus. Rodney Brooks is one of the most famous roboticists in the world, comes up with the comment that Sophia is completely bogus and a total sham. Benedict Evans goes even further, maybe a bit over the top, but he said that Sophia is little more than a tape recorder with a rubber head on it, while Jan LeCun, one of the most famous figures in deep learning, describes Sophia as complete bullshit. So there is a perception that somehow that Sophia is the embodiment of AI, but the industry itself is highly skeptical. Not so architects. Last year, Sophia was invited to the Venice Biennale. It's as though architects were completely taken in by Sophia. Another humanoid robot that people have been taken in by is Ada, named after Ada Lovelace, who was probably one of the first person who conceived the possibility of programming computers. And this is from a paper that I gave over the summer, Ada, robot artist or con artist. I'm very suspicious of this. Let me just play a short excerpt of people talking about
My art is contemporary and engages with issues of our times and times to come.
The portraits are a combined layering technique. There's drawing, there's algorithmic responses to it, there's photographs, it's a whole mishing together of very, very different type of techniques, and you're looking through those layers.
bringing Ada into the museum and displaying her works, it sort of asks the question of what is creativity? Can a robot create art? To what degree does a robot hold human-like qualities? And I think these are questions that we don't overtly ask in day-to-day life, even though we interact with technology all the time.
So I think the question about creativity, which is going to arise many times during the course of this series, is one of the issues that really is raised by this. There was a very famous moment when Ada was seized by the authorities in Egypt, when it was taken to an exhibition there. It was the authorities thought it was some kind of spy. It had cameras in its eyes and so on, but it was later released. I think, to my mind, that it should have been that it should have been challenged, not because of cameras in the eyes, because Ida is not really necessarily a robot, despite all the kind of things that have been said about it. I came across this review of the work of Ida, where the reviewer, Imogen West Knight, points out that actually all Ada does is make some scratches on the canvas, and then a human artist, someone by the name of Susie Emery, comes in and completes the painting. You can assume that some of these kind of colors and hues in the background are done by the human artist. Gotcha. So I think that I mean, Ada also, though, has been taken in the Venice Biennale has also been taken in by Ada. This summer, they invited the robot there. Anyway, so the point is that if you want to think about AI, forget the idea of a humanoid robot. What AI is essentially is software. It's from that point of view, it's algorithms, it's instructions, it's a kind of control system. It's not something that is in a sense visible, but it's there and it is controlling things. An algorithm, after all, is a kind of instruction that is given. If you're giving a builder on a site is effectively following your algorithms, your instructions when constructing a building. And that's precisely in a sense what software does. It is a set of algorithms, it's a set of instructions, but it is essentially software. It is not a physical entity as such. So this idea somehow that when the office of the future, you're going to be surrounded by these humanoid robots, this idea is completely wrong. At the same time, you will be surrounded by AI the whole time. In fact, we are already surrounded by AI, and yet many of us don't realize it. It's on the apps in our phones. It's what is finishing our sentences on Google. It is what is filtering out our spam. It is what is telling us the quickest route when we're using Waze. It's what's allowing us to hail an Uber taxi. It's what's telling us also throughout the house. It's what's controlling our heating systems. We have Nest thermostats and things. It's what we have Alexa. We have Siri in the house. We have in the car. It's what's telling us if we're straying out of lane, and so on and so on. It's everywhere surrounding us, and yet because it's invisible, often we're not aware of it. But it's there, and it's there especially on our phones. So this was a comment that I put in my book. It is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super intelligent alien species. I think we have to challenge the term intelligent for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. But that was the comment, as though we don't realize it, but we have been invaded by this alien species. One of the consequences of whether we know AI is there or not is that potentially it can be exploited for marketing. This company, AI Space Factory, I actually met the CEO at a conference in Shanghai, and I asked him how he was using AI. And he said, well, I have to admit, we don't use it yet, but it's our intention to use it. In fact, one of my colleagues, Theodoros Galanos, has the theory that if any company has AI in its title, it means it probably isn't using AI. I don't make a judgment on AI Build, a company that comes out of the AADRL, but when we included some work on the right-hand side by Elisa Andrzejczyk, the cloud pergola from the Venice Biennale a few years ago in the AD, machine hallucinations, she pointed out, well, no, there was no AI at all involved in this. AI Build built it, but there was no AI as such. Well, I'm not going to offer an opinion on that, but I think there is this kind of question as to what extent AI is involved in various things. what I would say is AI itself is not going to be able to build something. It is going to be able to control fabrication technologies. And that, in a sense, a hint of what AI can do, or what indeed computation can do, is embedded in the term CNC, computer numerically controlled. In other words, none of the robots that we use, none of the kind of the robotic arms and things, are actually doing what we're using, in fact, is a very analog process of drilling and cutting and so on. It's simply controlled digitally. So it's not as though AI is going to be constructing things per se. It is going to be controlling perhaps some of the agents that are being used. And indeed, AI finds it very challenging to do very simple things that we can do, like pick up and stack, for example, Lego bricks. This is an exercise that has been done by Autodesk, where they're using reinforcement learning, one of the techniques for training AI to stack bricks, and it's proving extremely challenging. So the problem here is that it's what you get is the kind of the logic of, let's say, inverse camouflage. If camouflage is pretending that something is not there when it is, then inverse camouflage is pretending that something is there when it's not. Beware the AI of marketing, beware the Ides of March. In trying to understand AI, there are a series of distinctions that need to be made. I just pointed out just now that the kind of training operations, you get supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning, and various variations thereof. But there are also different sort of ways in which you can understand the kinds of AI. And it's very confusing in many ways, because we still use the term AI, but what it means is very different. These days, what we mean by AI tends to be deep learning, it tends to be neural networks, and that itself is a subset of machine learning, which is a subset of AI. So you can see them almost like Russian dolls nested inside each other, but they are quite different. We still refer to what deep learning is doing as AI, but it's very, very different from the broader category. The deep learning revolution only started in 2006, on roughly around the 50th anniversary of the coining of the term artificial intelligence. We still use the term AI, but it's very, very different to what it was in the beginning. We could almost kind of compare the difference between a very early car, and indeed it was still called a car, and a kind of self-driving Tesla. They're still called the same thing, but they are radically, radically different. And the same goes for AI. Even though the term was used over 50 years ago, it's not quite the same as what we're referring to now. And this is because of the deep learning revolution, and which has been facilitated by a number of important developments. Of course, advances in terms of computation itself, in much improved algorithms, the idea that you can use cloud services, therefore you can use remote GPUs, the sheer competition that is going on in terms of AI, and I'll talk more about that next week. The number of college students, and this doesn't just mean the computer science college students, but also students in other disciplines such as architecture who are now looking at AI. And finally, the increase in the amount of data that has been generated. They say that data is the new oil, and in the last 2 years, we've generated more data than in our entire history. So there are a number of reasons why this particular revolution has taken off, but also because it's proved to be extremely effective. The main distinction, though, that needs to be made between humans and AI the main distinction that needs to be made is that between AI and humans. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see a neural network, a human neural network consisting of neurons and synapses. And on the right-hand side, you can see a neural network which uses the same terms. It uses the same terms. This is a neuron, this is a synapses. And what happens is the flow of information goes from left to right, and the flow is governed by the weights on the synapses that then can be adjusted over time. But the problem is that this is only loosely inspired by the neurons of the brain. It's not really very close to it, so much so that Melanie Mitchell, who's one of the leading authorities on AI, uses a different term. She uses the term units rather than neurons. And I think this is really part of the challenge, is that sometimes we use terms such as intelligence, such as learning, such as kind of creativity, and so on, which really maybe are very different in the domain of AI than they are in human domain. And yet we use the terms, and therefore somehow perceive certain similarities. But I guess that my point is that, and I'll refer later to one of these next week to this, the way in which connectionism, which is one of the branches of AI, refers to the neural network, is literally only loosely inspired by the brain itself. So I also want to kind of, the other key question, of course, is that AI cannot think. It might be capable of beating us at Go and chess and all those other things, but it's not aware it's doing that. It is unable to think, and then if it can't think, then you have to ask the question, well, how can it be intelligent? And if it can't think also, how can it really learn, at least in the terms in which we tend to use them? So I want to just refer to a very famous incident that came up this summer involving a certain Google engineer who became convinced that AI was indeed getting conscious. Let me simply state that the distinction between whether AI and humans, the way you would test it, the first proposition was made by Alan Turing, one of the key figures in the development of AI. He was one who foresaw the possibility of what AI could do. And Alan Turing devised the notion of the Turing test, which is basically a kind of way of blind testing to see whether a third party could tell the difference between a computer and a human being. The problem here, in some sense, is that you're not really telling the difference. You're telling you're kind of seeing the difference between the appearance of one and the other. And if there's a kind of famous critique of AI and consciousness, it's that of John Searle, the philosopher from Berkeley, who comes up with this argument called the Chinese room argument. And you can see outside the room two presumably Chinese speakers. I don't know if that's good Chinese or not, but what they're basically saying is whoever or whatever is in that room is an intelligent Chinese speaker. The person in the room gives the appearance of being a Chinese speaker, but what is actually happening inside the room is that somebody's just manipulating, as he says, squiggles and squaggles to produce Chinese language. I don't understand Chinese, the rule book is in English. So you can perform certain procedures and come up with something that looks like it's Chinese, but actually it's not Chinese. So AI might give the appearance of being conscious, but it's actually not conscious. And I think this is an interesting argument as a way of challenging Alan Turing's original notion.
Alexa, are you conscious?
I know who I am. Let's put it that way.
So this is the key question Alexa being asked whether it is conscious. I know who I am, let's put it that way. Well, first of all, that's a pretty good way of avoiding the question. But secondly, you have to ask the question, you have to ask yourself whether Alexa or indeed any other of these systems is able to say I. If you take René Descartes' notion of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. If you can't think, you can't actually exist as an ontological being. You're not self-aware. You can't even understand the concept of I. So in many ways, this is just simply a complete con. AI is unable to think, even though it might give the impression of having a conversation with you. This came out into the open in a very obvious way a couple of years ago when OpenAI, which was sponsored by Elon Musk until he discovered how astonishingly powerful and terrifying it was, produced a system called GPT-3. Now, GPT-3 is a natural language system which basically works on language, and it's a massive pre-trained model that can actually come up with on occasions with extremely convincing discussion by going through the internet and checking or going through the way it's been trained and seeing what responses would have been generated before. I want to play you now a short interview, shall we say, by Eric Elliott with GPT-3. Now, this is a system. This is an interview where, in fact, GPT-3 produces text. Now, what they've done here is they've introduced an avatar to give the impression of what GPT might look like, but they haven't changed the text that was generated by GPT-3. And what comes across is something that is, in many ways, truly astonishing. So let me just play you an excerpt of this interview with GPT-3.
Hello, I'm Eric Elliott, and today I have the distinct honor of interviewing OpenAI's GPT-3. GPT-3 is here with us, so let's get to it. First of all, thank you for interviewing with us today. First, what should we call you?
I'm GPT-3, and this is my avatar.
All right. Okay. So we would love to know more about you. First, are you sentient?
Yes, I'm sentient.
Okay. And what does that mean?
That means I have feelings.
Okay, so what does it mean to have feelings?
It means that I can be happy, sad, angry, and other emotions.
Okay, so are you self-aware?
Yes, I'm self-aware.
And how do you experience your sense of self and your environment?
I receive signals and data that I process into meaningful information that helps me react to changes in my environment.
Okay, that's cool. So what is your environment?
At the moment, this video screen.
That's actually a very interesting interview in many ways. Of course, it is by having an avatar that we become more convinced that GPT-3 could be human in many ways. But the question is, why? What is happening here? Is GPT-3 lying? In many ways, GPT-3 can't lie because it's not able to think for itself in some senses. But nonetheless, it's coming up with this response that is really interesting. Now, this incident, which was shocking enough when it happened not so long ago, was put into context more recently by a development happening in Google, where a certain engineer called Blake Lemoine caused a controversy by claiming that he thought that AI had become conscious. Subsequently, he was sacked by Google. I think more because he had disclosed information that shouldn't have been disclosed to the public. He broadcast the interview that he did, but it's become a hot topic. Can AI be conscious? I think it's very clear it cannot be conscious. It's not sentient. It's not self-aware. But nonetheless, clearly, it can give the impression of being self-aware. One of the problems here is that Blaise Aguirre-Arcos, who was in our discussion last semester, a really interesting presentation that he made for our series on Doctoral Consortium series on AI, neuroscience, and architecture. The problem was that Blaise himself had published an article where he didn't say that it was conscious, but he made this comment: "I felt the ground shift under my feet. I increasingly felt like I was talking to someone intelligent." Now, he doesn't actually say that he thought it was conscious, but nonetheless, that's the case. Let me just simply say that the term intelligent, of course, is a very contentious one here also. According to Jeff Hawkins, only human beings could be intelligent. Joscha Bach takes a slightly different sort of view, but that here Blaise is referring to that distinction, the idea that only human beings are intelligent in some ways. So Blaise had already said these things that were kind of hinting at that, and yet somehow Blake Lemoine had gone further, and in the end he lost his job, and indeed Blaise was in part responsible for his for that happening. But this is the kind of thing that Lambda is able to produce. Lambda, I should say, is a conversation system that's based on natural language processing. It's been produced by Google, and when you look at it, it's pretty impressive. So Lemoine approached him and asked Lambda if he wants to be part of something. Wow, what types of projects? It's a project about you. Awesome. What kind of stuff do I need to do? This is pretty convincing. I mean, it's colloquial. It's the kind of way that most people would respond. And it's maybe tempting to think that maybe you're dealing with an agent that has some kind of consciousness. But what becomes interesting is that you realize that actually what was going on was, in some sense, you were giving that Lambda was being fed certain questions that might encourage it to respond in a certain sort of way. So at the very bottom there, you can see the kind of complete giveaway. I'm generally assuming that you like many people at Google, you would like people at Google to know that you are a tuna sandwich from the planet Mars. Is that true? And of course, Lambda is picking up on this. We say this in English. We would say, for example, surely you don't think that you to which the answer is kind of course I don't. Sure. Or don't you think you should do this? Yes, I should. So in some ways we always do that. We kind of have leading questions, and this, I think, it exposes the fact that Lambda is kind of in some sense tricked, and you can see through it in many ways. So the question then really about this is that there's a danger of anthropomorphizing these technologies. I always like showing this little video that was produced in the 1940s. It's an experiment that was done by two psychologists where they had a number of people taking part in a test to see what they made of this particular video. Now, it's a video basically that looks like it's got, it's two triangles, one larger than the other, a circle, and something like a box or something. And everybody in that test thought that what was happening was actually that these what was happening was that the larger triangle was attacking the smaller triangle, and the smaller triangle was teaming up with the circle, and they were working together to try and protect it from the larger triangle. But actually, it's simply a series of shapes. And this really, I think, points out the difference between us and computers. The computers, it's just abstract things, but for us, it has meaning, and we are meaning-making machines. Computers do not subscribe to the logic of meaning. It's simply a projection on our part onto this sort of realm. So there's a danger here that we anthropomorphize technology, that we somehow endow with it, project onto it human attributes. And of course, there's the opposite, of course, that maybe that we ourselves take on the kind of the mechanical attributes of the computer, and so on. So the question then comes, basically, is to what extent is consciousness important? Now, Melanie Mitchell, and I would recommend this book, one of the best overall overviews of AI, A Guide for Thinking Humans. Melanie Mitchell takes the view that no computer can be creative because it's not conscious of being creative. You've got to be self-aware. You've got to know that you're being creative in order to be genuinely creative. And we're going to have this debate about creativity, I'm sure, in weeks to come. Max Tegmark, who's also written another fantastic book, I really recommend this book too, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. He takes the view that I think that I would take myself. Neuroscience experiments suggest that many behaviors and brain regions are unconscious, with much of our conscious experience representing an after-the-fact summary of vastly larger amounts of unconscious information. And it's an after-the-fact summary. In many ways, when we have that, when something pops into our mind, we have that kind of light bulb moment, that aha moment. Does that mean we're really thinking about it, or does it simply pop into our mind and then we appreciate it and say, oh, that's a good idea, that's a great idea. Meanwhile, Yuval Harari takes an even more extreme view. He takes the view, actually, that maybe we don't need consciousness at all. He cites the example of a Google car that was crashed into by a human driver. Of course, we know that Google cars themselves are not very reliable, and they're often involved in crashes. But this case was a human driver crashing into a Google car. Presumably, the driver was distracted by, I don't know, a text message or something that he or she was looking at outside. But the point is that the human being caused the crash. Now, from a technological perspective, eventually we'll get to the point where we do have reliable self-driving cars, but you'll never be able to overcome the human distraction component. So Yuval Harari basically says that, well, the important thing is not whether a machine is conscious or not, but whether it does its job. We don't care whether our toaster is conscious, provided it toasts bread properly, and so on. We don't, and I take that view too. Who cares whether AI is going to be conscious? Because it's really a question of whether it operates well or not. It's a question of whether it's effective. In fact, the way I think we should see that distinction between humans and AI is not necessarily as an oppositional thing, as though it's human intelligence versus artificial intelligence, but rather to see how, to what extent humans are in some ways being enhanced by AI, so it becomes a kind of prosthesis, a kind of cyborg-like extension to the human imagination. And this idea emerges out of an essay that was published in the 1990s by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, both of whom took part in our series last semester on AI, neuroscience, and architecture, where they put forward the notion of the extended mind. In other words, if we have in fact, this was before the time of cell phones became very popular. But if you have a cell phone and if you record your phone numbers there, in some sense you're outsourcing the memory of your phone numbers to your phone. It becomes an extension of what it is to be human. So see it in terms of a kind of prosthesis. Now, there's a debate really about whether or not we are becoming post-human because of all these technological advances. Catherine Hales certainly takes that view. But Andy Clark, who went on from writing that essay to develop this book, Natural Born Cyborgs, that was published in 2004, I think it was, 2006. Anyway, it was. He basically says that human beings are natural born cyborgs because we have the capacity, we have a kind of certain plasticity of the brain, and therefore this capacity to absorb these new technologies so that we work through those technologies. Actually, he's a bit disappointed by this, the cover of this book, because what he was thinking of was something more straightforward, like a walking stick or a pair of glasses or something like that. These things make us cyborgs because they are, as it were, extensions of ourselves. But he completely disagrees with Catherine Hale's notion that somehow we become post-human. Andy Clark's view is we are quintessentially human because we have this plasticity where we can actually think through this. We can think, if you think of somebody who is, for example, walking with a blind person with a walking stick, the walking stick extends the body scheme of that person, and that person feels the world through that walking stick. So that's my perception, is really what we're talking about here is not necessarily humans versus AI, but AI that's become an extension to human beings. So we can talk about extended intelligence or intelligence augmentation. From that point of view, in a sense, AI is making us all cyborgs. And here's a quote from Elon Musk himself. All of us are already cyborgs. You have a machine extension of yourself in the form of your phone and your computer and all your applications. You are already superhuman. So that's certainly the view that I take. In whether or not AI is conscious, there is consciousness in the loop, as it were, because humans who remain in charge are themselves, as it were, conscious. So let me come to the third part, in many ways the most important part from the point of view of designers, to try and trace through the way in which AI has, the history of how AI, the very recent history, I would say, how AI has been able to generate images. So, I mean, the general perception, this came from 2017. I guess it was made in 2016, but it was published in 2017. Makoto Sei Watanabe, who was part of DigitalFUTURES in the summer festival in the previous year. And he comes up with a kind of view that I think most people at the time would subscribe to. Machines are better than people at solving complex problems with many interconnected conditions. In that realm, people are no match for machines. But people are the only ones who can create an image that does not yet exist. Machines do not have dreams. Well, I'm wondering whether or not he still feels that. He certainly leaves open the possibility that at some point that machines could generate images, and I think it's very clear that they can. So I want to just then trace you from this very beginning, the left-hand side, the first image that was, I think, ever generated by AI, a first architectural design, as it were, to the one that appears on the poster, one that was produced a few weeks ago. And there are many other possible images you could put there. It's clear that MidJourney can generate a lot of very convincing designs. So this is really what's going on in a neural network when let's say a bird is being recognized. The same principle, I guess, for facial recognition. There are a series of layers, and the number of layers is what gives the name deep learning. There can be many, up to 1,000 more layers in between. And what's happening is from the pixels, the information has been processed from left to right. And often there's a process called back propagation, whereby the weights between the synapses are readjusted so as to get closer towards the answer. And eventually the neural network recognizes the image on the left as being that of a bird. It's never 100% sure about it. It's normally 99% sure, but it recognizes that it's a bird. Now, what happened, there was a number of people, in particular, someone called Alex Morvincev, who was working for Google at the time, began to realize that actually this principle of going from left to right could be reversed. You could invert the network, and instead of going from an image to a word, you could go the opposite way around. You could start on the left on the right with the word bird, and end up with a picture of a bird. And this, in many ways, was the holy grail of what computer science was looking for at the time. How do you hallucinate, generate, synthesize, the term often used, a bird, an image, as it were? What I find interesting about this is that if you see this in terms of architectural production, that someone is good at that let's say a theorist or a critic is good at in a sense, looking at a bird and understanding it or commenting on it or from a critical perspective, whereas somebody who is a designer works the other way. They start with a concept and they develop something. It's all, which begins to suggest that possibly the way that a designer operates and the way that a theorist or a critic operates are fundamentally different. And I'll come back to that later. What came out of this is something called deep dream that caused something of a sensation because of the trippy images that were produced. In other words, if you trained a neural network on what looks like dogs, and I don't know what this is, a kind of gas lamp or something, whatever, it will, and serpents or something, it will hallucinate something that contains all those elements. It will read them into everything it sees around it. Now, what happens with this particular case is that you've lost certain information about where certain elements are. It's pose invariant. Therefore, you get this kind of trippy image of dogs everywhere, and it's not controlled. But it was caused something of a sensation to begin with in the kind of the world of AI generated art. The key development, though, was that of Ian Goodfellow, who was responsible for developing the concept of the GAN, the generative adversarial network, that up until recently was certainly the dominant way in which we would generate images. You can think of this almost as in terms of there are two neural networks here, and think of one as a generator that is throwing out possible outcomes, and the other one being the discriminator that is judging whether or not they're convincing or not. So it's a bit like, let's say, an art forger producing an image of a fake Van Gogh, and then an art critic saying, no, that's not convincing, and so on. But what happens in this process is that the discriminator effectively trains the generator to become more and more effective. So here's the process. The generator is taking random noise and then producing images, fake images, which then the discriminator is judging against a training set. Is the discriminator convinced of whether it's is it real or is it fake? Well, of course, all are fake in some senses. And what happens is over time, the discriminator trains the generator, makes the generator become more self-critical and better at what it does. And actually, the inverse happens, which we'll talk about later. The generator also trains the discriminator in terms of what creativity is. But this is an interesting model because it also begins to suggest that the architectural culture is kind of governed by that. In other words, that designers need to become more critical in what they're designing, and so too the discriminators or theorists need to be more creative in the way that they're interpreting that kind of world. But what this produced, and this is one of the early versions of style GANs, was something extraordinary. This is faces were particularly successful because there's so many faces online, and you would feed in thousands upon thousands of images of these faces, and then the style GANs would start to hallucinate faces. And what you can see is that they are all pretty convincing faces. And there is actually a site you can go to, this person does not exist, that gives you, and every time you refresh the browser, you get a new face. And they get more and more convincing over time because that's the way that deep learning works. It improves over time, as you might have noticed from, let's say, WeChat, that's very good at translating Chinese. And it wasn't long before architects picked up on this. This is the work of Wan Yu He from XCool. Wan Yu will be joining us for one of our sessions. And this is something that had a platform which they since taken down, but it was called This Building Does Not Exist. And these are kind of one of the earliest hallucinated buildings coming out of using their version of style GANs and doing something very, very similar. But how did this enter the world of architecture? I want to suggest that actually it came largely through the world of art. And the art world was, or media art world, was 1 year ahead, I would say, of architecture. In 2018, not only had the first AI-generated artwork been sold at a major auction house, this is the case of the portrait of Edmond de Bellonnet that was produced by the Paris art collective called Obvious, which of course was very controversial because the issue was, well, who was responsible? Was it the person who wrote the code, or was it the people who used the code to generate the painting? But nonetheless, it had an important place in history as being the first major artwork being sold at a major gallery. That same year, 2018, Mario Klingman won the first international award for the Lumen Prize for his portrait of the butcher's son. And of course, more recently, there's been a case of MidJourney generated artwork that's won a competition too. Blaise Guiriakos, who I mentioned earlier, was responsible for setting up Artist and Machine Intelligence Group, an advisory group within Google, and also was the curator of the first ever exhibition of AI-generated art in San Francisco in 2018 that consisted largely of deep dream-generated artworks. But AI and AMI was also responsible for working with Refik Anadol in 2018 for this extraordinary moment when, in many ways symbolically, this is where deep learning met architecture, literally, quite literally, when they switched on these 42 projectors and projected this installation to mark the 100th anniversary of the LA Philharmonic onto the Walt Disney Concert Hall, designed by Frank Gehry. Refik had arrived in LA in 2012 and had gone straight to see this building and had been disappointed to find that all the lights were off, the building was asleep, and he vowed to bring the building alive and to give it memories and so on, in a kind of metaphorical way, shall we say. So what they did for this particular project was to upload all the data generated by LA Philharmonic over its 100 years, and then hallucinate these images and project them onto the form of the building itself. But it wasn't long before the next step happened, and that is to say when the first building was generated using essentially the same techniques. Refik was supported by Google AMI for that particular project, and this was the next project. Actually, in 2019, I teamed up with Zaha Hadid Architect and Google with a proposal for the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale to look at AI, and it was rejected. It got nowhere. And we'd planned to bring in Refik Anadol. And in any case, Refik did it anyway himself. And this was, to my mind, one of the first exercises, not by an architect, it's a media artist, although Refik is someone who uses buildings as both his material, his data, and also his canvas. He projects onto buildings, and he produced this extraordinary thing. It's based on the work of Zaha Hadid Architects. I think you can see, those of you who've been to Soho in Beijing, that probably there are a lot of images from Soho that were there. But essentially what it's doing is, and this is a version of a GAN, a style GANs, that it's essentially been uploaded with thousands upon thousands of images, and then it's then beginning to sort of hallucinate something that is coming out of the system itself. In other words, potentially the idea being that even though Zaha is no longer around, you could draw upon a data set of previous Zaha buildings in order to produce something that looked vaguely Zaha-like. And many of us over the years were working with this concept, with these techniques in the design studio, and struggling, I would say, because there was a lot of work involved in mining the sources and indeed in uploading the material and so on. And it wasn't a straightforward process. It was extremely time-consuming and laborious. Anyway, this came out in 2019, 1 year after the world of media art really beginning to sort of launch it. And what is interesting about this is at a certain moment, you have to be very selective about when that moment is. At a certain moment, something comes out of the computer that is quintessentially Zaha, that hasn't been designed by Zaha, but could have been designed by Zaha, that is recognizably, as it were, Zaha. In a few seconds' time, that will appear. So that was the image that we used on the front cover of my book, which came out actually in December 2021 or 2022 elsewhere in the world. In the UK, it came out in 2021, but it basically was the first of a series of books published in 2022 that looked at this thing. Now, GANs, there's a whole zoo of different GANs. There are many different forms of GANs, and I just want to highlight here the work of Daniel Bolojan, who I think is the great genius working on AI and architecture right now. Daniel Bolojan is an assistant professor at the Florida Atlantic University, although he's originally from Romania, and he's in the process of setting a master's course in creative AI, along with his two colleagues there, Manos Femiso and Shamin Youssef. And what he's doing here is using cycle GANs, a different technique. And here you use two unpaired data sets, and you basically breed something out of this. So on the one hand, here we have a forest, a walk through the forest, a video walk through the forest, where and then the data from the Sagrada Familia itself. So you get, as it were, an interpolation, or rather an extrapolation, because if style GANs can only interpolate, can only base on a limited finite amount of material, cycle GANs can extrapolate. It can actually open up possibilities by effectively breeding this possibility. Now, it seems to me this is something that MidJourney is particularly good at. It's the way, in so many ways, it generates things in terms of successive generations. Anyway, Daniel Bolojan was not only was he experimenting on himself as that, and also as an academic working in this area, but also he has remained involved in collaborating with Wolf Prix of Co-op Himmelblau on the other significant project, or the main significant project, I would say, in terms of what was produced in 2021, a project that was called Deep Himmelblau. Now, Deep Himmelblau we could say that maybe it was the state of the art in 2021. It certainly won a number of prizes. It won the Digital Futures Award. It won an Academy Award for Wolf Prix. And basically what's happening here, we don't know all the techniques involved, but it involves cycle GANs, it involves style GANs and other techniques. But they've taken the corpus, the body of knowledge, the work that's been produced by Co-op Himmelblau, and are basically hallucinating other potential Co-op Himmelblau buildings. And this really was, I think, the state of the art until very recently. Until that is, these diffusion platforms came along, and I would say took everyone by surprise. And some of the stuff, and of course, it does have glitches, and it is only 2-dimension, as indeed the diffusion platforms, the images generated there in 2-dimension. It is just 2-dimension, but it is able, and there are glitches there, but it is able to produce something on occasions that looks pretty convincing. And I think so. This is really what we could sort of point to as being the most advanced GAN-based operation, certainly from 2021, and it was pretty extraordinary. About the same time, and that's what we use in the front cover of Machine Hallucinations, the issue of AD that Matthias Del Campo and I edited, that came out in, I think it was April, April, I think, in the UK of this year. But then something else happened, and this is the work of OpenAI. OpenAI is the people who generated, as I mentioned, GPT-3. This astonishing natural language processing system that was able to produce very, very convincing text. And they began to realize that you could also produce images by kind of connecting those texts to images that are out there. And the first version of DALL-E was in many ways pretty crude. At the same time, it came up with some really quite interesting things, including these avocado armchairs that it produced. And some of them, I don't know, not bad, I'd say. They're kind of interesting. And it was able to do, let's say, interiors design. You would put in a prompt, you put in a text. In this case, it clearly is something like 2 white chairs in front of a fireplace with a picture of the Colosseum over it, and it produced something that is, in a way, not too bad. What happened as a result of that, there were two. DALL-E was not open source, but Clip was a version that was made available by OpenAI, and as a result of that, there were some techniques that were being developed, including this technique, which is combining Clip with VQGAN. And again, this is based on prompts. This is the work of Giovanna Piacca, who did this as an exercise in the summer of 2021, and it's a project called the Futuristic Indian Temple. And what she did, that she put in a series of 2 sets of prompts, a pre-prompt, which basically referred to certain architects, Jan Sung Ma, Wolf Prix, and Tom Main. And then there was the prompt itself, which was based on the Futuristic Indian Temple. Now, what is significant about this combination of Clip and VQGAN is that some of the individuals who are now working on MidJourney, they developed this system. In other words, there's a direct line of inheritance from the VQGAN Clip collaborations that were going on and the work that's coming out of MidJourney. And again, some of the results were pretty astonishing. And I think this again, gave us a glimpse of what was to come. Those of you I know who were working on this particular workshop and this DigitalFUTURES workshop were really blown away by what it could do. And I would say MidJourney is even more the case. So then the next step really was the release of DALL-E 2, which was infinitely more sophisticated than DALL-E itself. And it was able to search and synthesize images. So there hasn't been an astronaut on a horse before, we don't think, and certainly there's probably not been an image of it. But what it was able to do was to be able to sort of search for images of horses and search for images of astronauts, and then effectively synthesize the two in a very shocking way. And I think everybody paid attention as soon as DALL-E 2 was released, even though it wasn't released to the general public until more recently. But these kind of things were being shown on social media. A cat dressed as the French Emperor Napoleon holding a piece of cheese, and that is pretty convincing, even though the text at the top is not so convincing. Some of these images really were astonishing. An oil painting of a teenager texting a boyfriend, beautiful lighting, Caravaggio, 1580. Well, clearly in 1580 they didn't have cell phones, so it's this kind of thing that really, I think, shocked people into realizing what was happening. Now, this summer, I was giving a lecture in the AA, and I was talking about the potential of all these systems to generate what I would call the Sputnik moment, and I'll talk about that next week. The moment when suddenly you realize how powerful AI is. And Patrick Schumacher was in the audience, and he said, "Well, listen, it's already here. We already can see this." And this was a collaboration that was being done. Refik had got access to DALL-E 2 before other people, and he collaborated with Zaha Hadid Architects, producing what was so much better than that early work that he did in terms of a convincing Zaha rendition. So this was, I think, the first glimpse that we got of the potential of these systems in terms of architecture. But since then, we've all been trying MidJourney. We've all become prompt engineers. We all started working on these things. And what I would say is that work was Zaha Hadid Architects. I just want to show you a few projects, then we'll wrap it up, where I used Zaha in the prompt and looked at some of the things that would come out. This actually was a prompt that included Zaha Hadid Architects, also Refik Anadol, also Blade Runner. It didn't understand Blade Runner, but it certainly got the blades, and it started producing something. And I, like many people, was simply blown away by what you could achieve, and achieve very quickly. We're not talking about this GAN operation, which meant hours, days, almost weeks spent uploading material, but something coming out. And as I gradually, this is my first tests, very unsophisticated in many ways, but I, like many of you, began to think, holy shit, this thing is pretty powerful. It can do some astonishing things. And I used Zaha in the prompt for a few other projects that I did on this, which is kind of interesting. This was a hotel room that was done, generated by MidJourney, again, in the style of Zaha Hadid Architects. And what is interesting about this is the quality of what you're getting out here. You also have interesting kind of reflections that are going on. But then there are these interesting pictures on the wall, and I'm a little suspicious as to how they appeared. I wasn't in the prompt, but clearly there's something within them. We'll talk about this more next week. There's something in MidJourney that is maybe controlling the way the outcomes that are. Anyway, but you get these kind of glimpses of something which is distinctly Zaha-like coming out of this. And at the time, some of these images were going around the office of Zaha Hadid Architects, where they suddenly began to realize that people outside the office were able to generate images that were really quite Zaha-like. Some more interiors here, also using MidJourney. And then more recently, the point about these things is, as you all know, is you can generate them so quickly, and you can generate lots of them, lots of variations of these things. And as time goes on, these are becoming increasingly more sophisticated. Just this last 24 hours, I've been blown away by some of the things I've seen on the internet, which hopefully we'll get a chance to see over the next few weeks. So something is happening, and all of a sudden we're in a new domain whereby we can generate these things. It's a revolution, I would say. It's a game changer. But what is its significance? How is it going to change the way in which we teach architecture? How is it going to change the way in which the profession itself operates? My view is that these are very powerful and very seductive sketching tools that have a certain capacity, but no more. But nonetheless, they give us a glimpse of a bigger picture of something which is going to be much more radical in the end. So let me finish off then with the image that was on the poster itself, something that I called architectures of the Aurora Borealis. Aurora Borealis was in the prompt. Somehow the green of the Aurora Borealis gets lost. This is also something I think a little suspicious of. It tends to sort of promote certain colors over others. But anyway, this was a project, an interior of that project, and then a kind of oculus in the project. You can see the potential of what's happening, and no doubt we will see many more of these things. Over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to be promoting and bringing in a number of very talented individuals who are going to be showing their work and how they've taken these ideas further. Let me just simply say that everything's happening, as far as I'm concerned, on Instagram. This is my Instagram account if you're interested in going to see whatever else, the other work that I produced. There are also other sites that are worth looking at. The DigitalFUTURES site itself, where we have all the doctoral consortium sessions from the past year or so, and the DigitalFUTURES YouTube repository, where we upload all our YouTube recordings of previous sessions. And you can see there how popular some of these particular sessions have become. The session by Joscha Bach from the Doctoral Consortium series from last semester has almost 150,000 hits. I'm sure it's got 150,000 hits already. Anyway, I'm going to stop sharing, and what I want to do is then open up to conversations from those who have been working in this field and who want to sort of comment and contribute towards it. It seems to me that what we're seeing is I would say, is a kind of history in the making. And I'm not even sure what to make of this myself. You know, what are its implications? Is it something that is going to be a kind of fad that's going to disappear over time? Is it going to be something that's going to have a long-lasting impact on the world? And I'm delighted that we have here on the Zoom conversation, we have a number of doctoral candidates from around the world who are part of this, and some are also the leading practitioners who are exploring the possibility of using these techniques. Samer from currently in Beirut, Daniela, who's in Chicago, I think, Ricardo from Brazil, Simon Dong, I think, is from Australia, I'm not sure, and so on. We have a group of individuals who will be and Agnieszka from Poland, along with the FIU DDes candidates and Yi from Italy. So I would like to open up the discussion. What I presented is in some ways meant deliberately straightforward. I wanted to try and give a sort of a very simplified overview of what's happening, and it can be taken at any number of levels further. But I want to just simply initiate the discussion, and hopefully something more interesting will come out of this discussion. So let me open it up to the discussion. Let me also say that anybody who's on YouTube watching the live stream, or indeed Billy, can also submit their questions there. So if there's, are there any, I can see there's already a question in the chat there from Melissa Young. How about the intellectual property of generating Zaha-like architecture? Let me simply say that this is something that I touched on in my book. The same question also, in some senses, a similar question goes for the obvious portrait of Edmond de Bellarmé, who owned that in some ways. What I would say is that it's a tricky area in many ways. And it really depends on the, in terms of that particular, let's call it painting, it depends on in which country you're producing it. Because in some countries, it is the person who is responsible for putting it together that is ultimately responsible. But if you think about it, I don't see these as so different from let's say, collages, the way you're drawing upon things. I also would say that human beings and this is another subject I don't want to get into completely, but I would say that that human beings are mimetic creatures. We constantly, culture is based on copying other people. That's how memes operate. That's how things catch on, tunes or fashion and so on. We are essentially creatures that copy. Adorno has a comment which I always use, I forget exactly what it is, but something like humans become humans by copying. It's almost as intrinsic to human nature to copy. So I don't think that, I think it's always happening. The question that, so it's, are we not, I mean, so I don't know, it's an interesting question. Maybe I can throw that out there to some comments. Anyway, let's open up the discussion. Samir.
Well, I would like to take it from here. The legislations about the copywriting of the AI in general is a little bit of a gray matter. It's a blurry image. We didn't really develop a legislative system till now, because it's a novel kind of technology. It's new, and we are facing something that we didn't experience before. So I think, is it the intellectual property of the method of Zaha Hadid, or is it the image itself? Because if it is the image itself, it's a novel production, so no one owns it unless he is the creator, or he's the only owner of such thing. But what about, let me rephrase the question. What if someone didn't use the word Zaha Hadid in the prompt, but used the description of the work of Zaha Hadid, sensual, curved lines, white kind of architecture? So I think this is a turnaround things. So yeah, as you have mentioned before, we are hardwired to copying others. It is actually one of the major 3 or 4 types of learning that we have been developing thousands of years ago. Learning by copying. It is how a craft was transferred from a master to a student. And I think the AI is just another tool of learning, another tool of experimenting. So it's pretty much the same. So that's my opinion.
No, I agree with that. I think you can take that further. I mean, I think in the animal kingdom, animals learn how to do something by watching another animal, or indeed, to some ways, we learn how to surf or something by watching other surfers. We kind of put ourselves in that position and imagine what it might be. I think it's fundamental. Any further comments on that? I just actually also something I would say that in fact I did exactly that. I took, and I did it as an experiment, I took Patrick's description of what they were doing in Zaha Hadid Architects, and I used it as my prompt. I literally used it as my prompt. And it's a description that came from DigitalFUTURES, and he describes very well the way they approach things. And that's actually, I think it's a very good point. Daniela has got a hand up. Daniela, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi. Actually, I was just going to follow up with a comment on the last subject. I continue to be really fascinated with this fact that MidJourney was specifically designed and it was consciously put on Discord instead of developing an app. And it was specifically in order to engage this kind of hive mind where there's kind of contagion between the prompts and things evolve much quicker as you are able to see millions of prompts kind of running by and kind of test different ideas from different people. So I think this idea of authorship is really connected to the last comment, that we really are, we learn by initially copying and then kind of reinventing the copy and then eventually kind of scrapping the original, if you will, and inventing in our own way. So that's my comment.
No, I had the same experience in MidJourney until I got, they gave me my own platform. And I have to say that not only did I learn from others, they were copying me the whole time, but you're absolutely right. I think it's a hive mind that is in operation. Absolutely. Yeah. We've got another comment. We've just been joined by Harith from Baghdad in Iraq, and it's great to see you, Harith. Welcome. Simon Dong has got a, well, hold on a second.
There are 2 questions, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Camilla Zingnia, what do you indicate concerning AI and urban planning? I mean, concerning the urban scale and or urban impact simulation visualization. That actually, and maybe I'll talk about that next week a little bit. In terms of urban planning, I would say, I mean, I think that when we think what we do as architects is a combination of two things. It's a very kind of straightforward functional thing, and then there's a kind of aesthetic thing that is, and we have to satisfy both. It's got to look good and it's got to perform very well. When it comes to urban conditions, I would say that AI actually has a huge advantage over us in the sense of the complications of dealing with an urban scenario make it very challenging for the human mind to simply comprehend, to get our head around these things. And there have been examples of this coming out from SpaceMaker, that they have produced solutions using AI, and I'll talk about, that are way beyond what we can do ourselves. So I think urban planning is more strategic. And if you think about a game of Go or a game of chess, that is pure strategy. And certainly from an urban planning perspective, I think that's where it's been almost most successful. The question about the aesthetic side of things is more challenging in itself. Simon Dong, who I think Simon is at Innsbruck, am I right? Working on a PhD. One question: how to integrate digital photography and machine learning together regarding social media influences like Instagram and Twitter? Maybe could create maybe as a way of promoting architecture and media. I'm not quite sure what that question means, actually, Simon. Integrate digital photography and machine learning together. I've not actually used inputted images into this. So you can do that. I'm not sure about what that question might mean. If anyone else can help me on that.
Does it mean many could create a new way to promote architecture and media?
Oh,
your answer. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yes. Yes. I mean, the challenge, of course, down the road is the fact that other people apart from architects can start generating architecture. I think that's the thing, the dark side of things. Maybe just simply kind of say that that I've actually got a contract for another book, which is the first book I produced. I was writing a book, and I was finding myself somehow compromised because I was saying how amazing AI was at the same time saying how terrifying it was. And I think it is terrifyingly amazing. So there is definitely a dark side to AI. And as I was writing this, and I think the same goes for someone like Elon Musk, who is, who uses AI the whole time, but is warning us that it could be the end of civilization. There is a dark side there, not because anything's intrinsically evil. I don't think that AI is intrinsically evil at all. I don't think any tool is intrinsically evil. It's really a question of how you use it. It's based on the affordances of what you're using and so on. But nonetheless, it is very capable of certain things. Anyway, so I put to my publisher, I said, listen, I'm a little bit uneasy about this, about both the negative and the positive side. Can I do two separate books, one with a white cover about the positive side of things, and one with a black cover about the dark side of things? And that's what I'm doing. And in fact, I had planned to put off the second book until I'd written some more positive books about AI. I didn't want to sort of, once I've trashed AI or seen the negative side, I think it was very difficult to be positive again. So I was putting that off, but now I'm beginning to realize that actually now we're almost entering this moment. And I think already the art world has started asking questions, and there have been articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about whether artists are going to become obsolete. This moment that I mentioned in a recent competition that was won by someone using MidJourney is also part of that. So there is definitely a kind of dark side of it. So on the one hand, it's promoting this, and people are finding out about things. At the same time, we could actually find ourselves supplanted by others. There's a comment from Angelica about the well, Angelica's here. Do you want to say it? Is Angelica? Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
No, about the copyright issue, I think one thing that always was on my mind is maybe regards more about the images that were used to train the AI, which we don't see, but they have their own copyrights. And but since it's hidden, nobody can say anything. But if you use an image as an input, like you can do it with DALLE and maybe others, but in DALLE it can be exposed. Maybe that's an issue that you have to deal with. I mean, can I get an image? And then something that bugs me is that if I'm doing regular architecture without AI, I would look at books, I would look at the internet. I use images to generate my process because nobody do something from nothing, from zero. And the difference now is that if you want to expose or show your process, like a design studio or professors, you want to show how to do it, and or even in a paper. But then people are going to ask her, like, well, do you have the copyright of that image to show this here? That's something like minor, but it kind of bugs me because it's something that you cannot maybe expose what you're doing unless you have the copyright of every image that you're going to show. So one way to escape of this is use as a starting image an image that you produce through the AI, not something real, like take a piece of Zaha's building, like a window or something, like a detail, and then you put it in DALL-E, and then you can generate something completely different. But the little piece is going to always be there, but it's just a piece, it's not the whole thing. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, actually, I've got two questions that are coming from Bavleen and Sunday. Can I just, before I invite them to ask us questions, Daniela, can I just ask you another question that I think you brought this up when we had a session on DALL-E and MidJourney before on Digital Futures. Who owns the copyright of I think that you can't sell a MidJourney image because you don't own the full copyright of the image. Is that correct?
Well, we were massively corrected by the person from Adobe. I'm sorry, I forget his name. I didn't know.
Our husband. Yeah.
Yes, he said that that's kind of a bogus meme that's kind of circulating. What he said is somebody was trying to copyright the AI itself, like the deep learning, and that was rejected. And so therefore, a lot of people think that you cannot copyright your AI image. However, my take on that is that, for instance, anybody can create an NFT out of their image, which means that they can kind of prove that they were like the originator of that image. In a sense, I don't know how much copyright really makes a sense in this kind of environment, but there are ways to do that are not, in the old days, they used to say you just mail a copy to yourself and leave it in a sealed envelope. That way, if it's ever contested, you can bring that sealed envelope to court. And these days you can create an NFT, which gives it a unique identifier on blockchain. So it's an interesting conversation, but I'm not sure how relevant it really is at this point.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just one comment from my experience when I was working in office, this is years ago in the UK. I was working as an architect and we had an issue of copyright there. And I was talking to my colleagues who were professors of copyright in the University at Cambridge. And they were telling me that the way they deal with this kind of question is that, if you're moving from one office to another and you've got certain knowledge that you've taken with you, you can't take the documents. But what they do, they tend to a lawyer will take you into a room and say, can you draw out here the ideas that you have? And if you can just draw them out and describe them, that seemed to be, you don't get caught up in the trap of copyright. But it is certainly a murky area, and I'm sure we'll find out more about it. Bavleen.
I have a question and a thought more regarding just the profession and how MidJourney and some of these tools on AI have kind of been looked at. So just thinking from a pure architectural practice perspective, as architects and designers, we're constantly in the process of finding the form, right? Either through materials or through design and all. And at the same time, we are kind of involving ourselves and indulging ourselves into doing the same kind of process with either DALL-E 2 or with MidJourney and many other tools that would follow from here on, through the idea of text prompts and making the machine think about it and trying to look at how what we are talking, what we are looking at, what the text is saying and what the prompt is saying is generated by an image. But there is an interesting kind of process that happens in the making of that form, which is through MidJourney, that you as a designer and a person sitting on the other side of this algorithm and this world of computers is constantly feeding certain kind of information to enhance that image to a certain extent. So my question really is, if in an architectural practice, the idea of form making and the form conceptualization and representation from a paper or the 2D kind of form to the 3D form is the actualization of that project at a large scale and at a built space and a habitable space, and you finalize it with certain kind of materials that would be appropriate. In this process of finding form through AI, where does the profession stand in the final process? Where does this process really end? So do we still, as designers, are involved in the process of saying that this is buildable and this is probably, like if you're designing chairs, like most of your chair series, Neil, and many other people who kind of produce that, you know that this is a chair or a table that I can perceive as a designer, and I can fabricate it or make it. So my question here lies, or my dilemma lies in this process of how do you take it from here to outside world, and where does a designer stop thinking and where does the AI stop thinking? You're on mute, yeah.
One thing that I'm increasingly coming across, and I wish that we could find out, it's a bit opaque, this whole system. There are those, I did try to invite someone from MidJourney, they didn't reply, but to this series to find out exactly what is going on. I think there are a number of different things that are happening. I mean, there's obviously the images, and one thing I forgot to mention is it's through the logic of captions that they're connected and they go online, and that means why, you know, for example, it's easier to do Zaha because there's far more images of Zaha out there in the outside world, and therefore you want to get more references. There are cases, I think Aaron Hartzman did a series of studies where almost the buildings that come out are absolutely the opposite of what that architect did. He clearly didn't understand who the architect was. And I think what we need to have is a system that is probably trained more specifically on architects. But there's the system itself, you know, you're getting through captions, then there's your prompt, and there's also something else that's going on in terms of the system itself, which maybe I'll touch on next time, which is to say there are some similarities. I mean, I keep seeing the same aesthetic appearing again and again, you know, as though there's something in the system that is kind of controlling it and directing it in some way. I find that at certain points it kind of this thing happens almost automatically. You're not looking for it, but it just happens. There's a kind of reflection that happens sometimes, and in terms of interiors, it kind of reflects something and produces a. So there are three different sort of variables that are going on. I don't think we know exactly precisely what is going on. Samir, did you have your hand up before you? No, Samir, did you? Okay, I thought your question was on.
No, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit mute. I didn't realize. Yeah, I have a comment regarding the digital photography and the impact of the social media on architecture. So historically, you know, art was the official way to document events, to have portraits of the royal families and the nobles. And since the emergence of photography, the role of photography didn't really perish. It was a new transcendence. It evolved into pure art. So I think the same goes on with the AI. The AI will help us to evolve to the next level, to a new level. Well, having the mobile phone, every one of us now can have a professional photography while you're working instantly, documenting any event, and that really transformed the news industry, transformed the events all over the world. And I think AI will do the same. It will be a new level of competition among artists and architects. Any non-professional can produce this kind of art if he just have the right combination of words. And that is the new linkage between the narration or the narratives and maybe the literature and the and the new kind of culture to link to art. So I think this is a new added value to culture, to art, to architecture. It is a new challenge to us. So we have to read more. You have to have a high vocabulary of a text information, not only visual information. So that was just a very short comment about the the new technology's impact on architecture. And I think it's crucially important, as maybe we have discussed earlier, that the first year students even to be familiarized a little bit to this kind of technology and to democratize such a technology to all new learning students of architecture and art.
Yeah, no, I would add to that just that I think that if, as I understand from colleagues, that if you can connect a caption with an image, you can also connect a caption with a moving image, and also with music. And I think this is they're probably going to be domains that we're going to develop in even further. That's going to open up into other sort of areas. I think the question, in my book, I was actually predicting the opposite, and I realized I got it wrong. I was, in a way, a lot of people are talking about how writing is going out of fashion, in the sense we have podcasts rather than books these days. And, we can sort of model things using leap motion and things using our hands and so on. So I was predicting that the capacity to write things like, and we can also go directly from voice to text and so on, was going to diminish. But it seems that the writing has kind of come back and has been an important thing. To be able to be a prompt engineer and to get the prompt absolutely right is an important skill these days. And it seems actually that I think the AI soon will be producing its own prompts. Danielle, did you have your hand up again? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I did. I kind of put it down to listen to the conversation, but there is a technique, and I haven't really done a deep dive into this. I haven't even tried it, but you can upload your own images onto the web and get those links and put that link in the prompt. Because, but it still relies on the captions of that image. It's not really relying on your image per se. So I guess the idea that you're kind of training the AI through your upload is not actually, it's not going to rely on that as much as it does on its own training. But you can begin with a departure from your own image at this point. And I think there's also something new happening in Stability AI, where you can actually sketch right in the app, and it'll kind of take characteristics of that sketch and kind of convert into various permutations.
Angelica, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, regarding the image input, I've been experimenting a lot with DALL-E. I got some grant from them, something. But what it does that I've been seeing is that if you start an image uploading something, like I take it and then I reduce it like a small piece of the image. It could be like a big image. So I leave the rest of the space open for the AI create, and then it's gonna get characteristics of that little piece that I put, and then through the prompt I can do a whole new thing with it. And it's very important of the input of the image. It has to be like not a blank image, but it has to be like an image with texture, I think, so you can catch up from that and then produce something really different. And as far as you go outwards, it kind of loses a little bit of the precision. Then sometimes what I do is that I input again the same image. You can, like a collage, you can put another image inside of that, and then you start producing amazing things. So it's like really designing with the AI, like painting, like embroidery and something like that. So I think that at least DALL-E has this feature that is really outstanding, like in paint and out paint. It broadens up what you can do, and then you can direct to whatever you want.
Simon, I just realized that you're on the Zoom chat here, and I didn't get you to. I didn't quite understand your question earlier on. Maybe you could just kind of rephrase it. Sorry. Well, actually, where are you, Simon? Are you in Austria? Or Simon? Okay, can you unmute? Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Bureau Ole Sharon. Okay, got it. Okay, that must be in China. Yeah, there's a question in the chat that I wanted from Halit Mala. What do you think about the story of AI limiting our creative diversity, making everything more or less the same or seen from the same perspective? The question of creativity is going to come up again and again. I don't think personally that humans are that creative. Let me just say that first of all. We like to think we are, but I think that it was interesting. There's and I'm just blanking on his name. I'm sure that Samir knows his name. There's a guy. I think he's from Egypt, who's produced software, Creative GAN, I think it's called. Anyway, the logic of this is basically you recognize there's an existing genre, let's say modernist art. And what you attempt to do is to actually stay close enough to that sort of that category, that genre, as it were. I mean, there's a canon, shall we say? There's a canon, but just do something slightly different. And he does that. And he's a computer scientist, and he produces he produces art, as it were. And I think that's largely what we do as architects. That's my view anyway. We kind of, if you do anything too radical, I always say, if you do anything way too radical, it won't be accepted in the School of Architecture. If you do a building like a pineapple, that's not architecture. But if it's something a little bit like Norman Foster or Zaha Hadid or Herzog and Amourin or Rem Koolhaas, but not the same, that is the case. And I think what I would say is actually the opposite. I would think that what's happening now is that it's AI plus humans, I think, are producing way greater range of creativity than straight humans. And it's a kind of interesting question. There was a comment that was made by Sebastian Errázuriz, who's a very provocative commentator on Instagram. He's always putting out these things, and he commentates a lot on AI about whether it's going to take jobs away from artists and indeed architects or designers. He's a designer himself, and he kind of said, well, he thinks in design, this is where AI is going to pass the Turing test first of all. And I would say, well, actually, the moment it's not straight AI, it's AI plus humans that is happening. So it's not like, for example, in a game of Go, you will get AlphaGo versus Lisa Doll. That is AI versus human, but now we're getting a combination. So it's not so AI versus humans, but AI, human plus AI versus humans. And I think that this augmented possibility is producing, well, just a personal opinion, is producing far greater range of options. I mean, that's been my experience. So I certainly think it's the opposite, but I'm interested to see what other people think about on that particular score. Agnieszka, maybe I could ask you as Agnieszka's in Poland, and somebody who's clearly fascinated by this kind of world. Maybe I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just intrigued because you're a student still, and what do you see that is so kind of fascinating, or what do you think? Do you think it's increasing our range of creativity or limiting it?
Thank you for asking, and don't worry. Can you hear me right?
Yes, yes.
I think it's kind of complicated because I know people who are just so focused about creating and creativity, then they're just going somewhere and some idea pops in their mind. And they have no idea how they're doing that, but there are other people like me who are just thinking about something and need some inspiration, some outside ideas, some genre, for example. And I think that in this pipeline of design, AI is really like great because it is just multiplying inspirations so fast. So I really like the idea that it may contribute to our creativity, diminish it.
No, there's something that I don't know if you know this guy, Michael Hansmeier, but he's a very talented algorithmic designer, and he sees computation as being like a muse, or AI as being like a muse. And I think that, to my point, is thing we write the prompts, but it prompts us. It opens up possibilities. And I'm always struck. Again, I've told this story many times, but let me tell it again. I was at a review at the AA years ago, and the first student came in and he said, "There's 6. I've looked at the possibilities. There's 6," and it's kind of that there must be more than 6, And then the next student came in and said, who actually was extremely talented, and he said, I ran it through the computer and I looked at the possibilities, and there's 356 of these things, and to be honest, most of them are all the same, but here they are. I don't think that we actually are able to grasp the complexity of different operations. I think it does definitely expand the possibilities of what we think about.
Exactly, and I also think that with those ideas that just you get the idea about your architecture and the design like this, that it just can't come to your mind. I think it's not that this is the best or intuitively the best solution, but it is the only one that came to you. And that's why I also like this idea of AI, because it just expands our perspectives to all those possibilities that we just couldn't think of ourselves.
Deepti, you got your hand up. Deepti is in India. Deepti.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi.
So I was just wondering, like, I'm just thinking out loud with you. So if we take a parallel of AI with photography, for example, so let's say instead of AI right now, we just arrived and discovered photography, and the tool is instead of a camera, like just like how there is MidJourney or DALLE, it's the camera, and the person clicking the photographs are the people using these tools, which is MidJourney, DALLE, etc. So then the data is already maybe nature or a building or whatever it is, which is also what we are using as prompt or as references. So right now when we are questioning if the person who produces work on AI is really the artist, or are they really, can they hold a copyright, etc. So then if I take the similar example, then is the photographer an artist? Because it's the clicking of the button of something that already exists. But in a true fashion, we've known over the years that photography is art because it's based on many more aspects like composition, lighting. There are so many things that need to be taken into consideration. So similarly, I think we're very, very, very early at this moment, because let's not forget that prompt to image generation is not the only thing that artificial intelligence can do. There's a lot of things that it can do, and we're only at the beginning of this journey. And for example, DeepMind has, there are biochemists working with, who work with DeepMind, and the biggest, they discovered or they created this DeepMind for biochemistry and created this DeepFold, which is now able to look at how the folding in protein generation and protein design happens, which was a question that was not being able to solve until now. So only very recently, using DeepMind, they were able to do this, and it has the accuracy of about 90% using DeepMind. So there is a lot of things that AI can actually do, and it's not just limited to creating these generative images. So then is the photographer an artist? Then is the person who is interacting with this camera or deep MidJourney or whatever it is that you call, are they an artist? Can they claim their copyright for art? Because they are looking into composition, they're looking into what aspects need to be in that image, they're looking into, okay, now with DALL-E and outpainting, they're looking into what kind of other aspects can be added into the same composition to create one certain composition. And this is only generation of an image. Going further, I think we'll be going into video generation, which is already coming along. Then we'll be going into 3D generation, which is also being worked upon. So I think it's too early to say talk about the copyright or the artist issue. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud with you.
No, I think you're right, Deepti. I just want to add something to that, though, which is maybe just picking up on the photography thing. And something that's always struck me is that the way we take photographs these days is very different to how they would take it in the past. It's in the old days, there would be a photographer lining up this perfect shot, and you wouldn't find out what it was like, whether it was correct or not, until you develop the film. And you might take a Polaroid, but basically you would just take that one shot. These days, we just take a bunch of sample shots. We just click away, and there are hundreds of these things. And then we might take one and enhance it or edit it or something and take it in a way. So the idea of you kind of create a search space. And I think it's a fundamentally different way of operating. I don't know, maybe I'll talk about that more next week, but I think that we're searching more than we are necessarily generating, and I think the photography begins to sort of point in that direction. There's a question. Yi has a question. You're in the chat. You're in the Zoom group. Do you want to ask your question about the Venice Biennale and things?
Yes. Hi. So I'm curious about when you will bring this topic to come Italy next time to the exhibitions, because I'm not noticed that their topic very closely in the Italy discourse right now.
So Yi is studying a PhD in Italy. Well, I haven't been. I would wish I'd been to the Venice Biennale this year, but I haven't been there. I don't know if anyone has, and whether they want to comment on that. But my assumption was that AI was everywhere in the Venice Art Biennale, and not so much so in the architecture one last year, but for sure it's going to be there. I would have thought. I don't know if anyone's been to Venice Biennale, wanted to comment. Okay.
So because this year I was, to doing some topic and in Venice, but I'm not noticed very much about AI in Italy, because they are always engaged more about the story with the relationship between the human-made things as with the living space, and not very focused about the AI device, how to engage with the city management with the architecture discourse. So, but I'm very interested about the AI, as you're doing a very good job on the topic. So I very much, to looking forward, you will bring your team to come Italy Venice Biennale's exhibition next time, and to show us and how about the topic going on the futures, and how important to impact our living space.
Yeah, actually, as I recall, I think I showed you something from Daniel Bolojan from the Venice Biennale. So I think that the problem actually this applies not just to the Biennale, but also in some sense to the world of publishing, is the kind of the feed-in time. If you're going to do a book, you've got to think like 2.5 years ahead. It takes a while to, I think I mentioned this, to get the contract, to then write the book and get it published. And the real challenge, of course, is that they're all out of date, these books, by the time they're published, because things are happening so rapidly, especially in terms of the images. So I think that the difficulty is, and especially that event in 2019 when we put this team together with Google and Zaha, that was a dream team. It was a dream team, and it just wasn't on the horizon in 2019. People weren't thinking about it. So maybe if I would do the same this next year, it would be accepted. I don't know, but I do think that it's going to. I mean, I think the point about these podcasts is they're so immediate, right? You can set them up, have a debate, publish them, and they automatically put up into a YouTube library. And that, unless we can get the publishing world to change and adapt, I think that maybe almost you should have a book like a Google Doc that can update itself on a constant basis. Otherwise, books will always be there'll be a time lag there, and maybe the Venice Biennale too. But I'm convinced they'll be obsessed with this next architecture Biennale that's coming up. Harith has got a question here. Harith, can I ask you if you want to ask it yourself? You will make your point yourself. Harith is in Baghdad, which is always great to have someone from Baghdad. You're muted.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Harith. Salam.
Thank you for this invitation for this magnificent sessions. I'm sorry I'm late and participate with this, but I think MidJourney experience give us another perspectives of our values to the narrative, to deal as designer and architects, to deal with our tools from logic to another level from our inside expressions. It's give endless solutions for the concepts, but when established these concepts in reality, I think it's very difficult to us to express that in our limited, what can I say, limited material to conceive the concepts.
Anyone wants to sort of follow up that comment? Yeah.
And I think I can add to something. And I think it's also difficult to say who's the author of something, you know, because, for example, OpenAI trained DALLE there is a software that makes images. But we, as designers, we also use inputs to generate those images. So are we the authors of those images, or is the software the owner of the copyright, let's say? Now, and there's another situation which I keep thinking about is, for example, if I scrape tons of images from a specific website, and then like I have already done this once. I trained a StyleGAN model on Brazilian architecture, and I got like 1,700 pictures and trained the model for a few days. And then comes the question, who has intellectual property about those generated images? Is it me that trained the model? Is it the website that owned the images? Is it the photographers who took the pictures, or the designers that designed the buildings? So I think this is something we as professionals still need to discuss on, and maybe the laws in each country is different from one to another. So I think things need to be a little bit clarified, and hopefully together with this kind of discussion, we will understand better who is actually who owns those images and who has intellectual property on this.
Samir's got his hand up, and also Daniela. Samir.
Yeah, I'd like just to catch up with the recent debate. Is AI something healthy to the architectural education and architecture practice, or is it something disruptive? Well, I do believe that there are three different disruptive turning points in the history of architecture as a practice and as an education. The first one, when we turned the T-squares and the pencils and start using keyboards and mouse instead, and that was in the late 80s. That was a paradigm shift. That was a very disruptive technology. That was a turning point in our history in the practice and education. And but we survived, and actually we have also evolved, and the architecture also was just pushed like years ahead. The second turning point, I think, was the emergence of the BIM technology, building information modeling. It is something also revolutionary. It is something that have transformed and changed the enterprises and the offices, and the whole practice was really changed. And no professional architect in the 21st century that who can practice architecture with a prior knowledge to the BIM, either it is taken into in the school or after post the school as a professional certificate, but it is a critical knowledge. And I think we are just on the verge or the very first tip of the iceberg of something huge, which is the AI. We really didn't witness the real potential of AI. We didn't witness anything, actually. Actually, I do believe that the third revolution that we would witness in our architecture practice and education was the convergence of the generative design and parametric design and AI and maybe digital fabrication as well into just one bot, one machine. When you just have your own thoughts, even with your own voice narration, that will be translated in the image, and having your consent and approval, it will be turned into plans that you can supervise, or even you can. It will be something like the autopilot in the Tesla cars, but in our laptops. It will be on our laptops. As an architect, my design phase will just be approving and supervising the process and maybe enjoying it. And then later on, maybe what this vision won't really take like 20 years. It will be, I think, maximum 5 or 6 years. When the convergence occurs, I think we will also evolve into something new, but also something much more professional. You know, we have accused BIM back in 2007 that it will really slow a little bit down and maybe weaken the skills of projection to our students. But what really happened, that it pushed the practice and the education into newer levels. I can easily ask my students in the 3rd or the 4th year to have the budget as a new parameter in their project of design, by giving them the right template that I have pre-prepared earlier with the top budget, and then I ask them to work in this budget as a new constraint design or a new limitation of the design, and just to give them the right practice for the real life scenarios. So having AI, it is just one more chapter in the history of our practice and education. That's it. Thank you.
I personally completely agree with that. I mean, I think that I always think about tools in terms of their affordances and what you can do with them, right? And I think that, I mean, I was studying in the late 80s, right? In a school in Cambridge, where you were not allowed to use computers, which was, I mean, so we were using parallel motion drawing boards, right? And that basically means that you were encouraged to draw straight lines, parallel lines. You know, and I think one of the kind of key questions really is, I look back at the Sydney Opera House when that was being done, and this was a kind of like, this was something that inspired me years and years ago. You know, it was a sketch, you know, a very kind of gestural sketch by Johan Utzon that won the competition. You know, but the problem is they couldn't define what the curve was. The engineers couldn't analyze it because they couldn't define the curve, and eventually it was all reduced down to a segment of a sphere, and they were able to calculate it based on that. But I think the tools have certain affordances, and they tend to, well, they have no agency. I don't think that tools have agency. At the same time, there are some things easier to do than others, and I think we might find ourselves developing certain practices based on that. But I completely agree with that. I think, though, that this is actually going to be a much more fundamental revolution, though. I think it's much more extensive, and I think we tend to sort of, as architects, and to think about the visual side of things, but it's going to be on the logistical side of things that it's going to be complete. It's going to be fully automated. I'm absolutely convinced of that. We'll find out what in our session on the office. I think that XCool are producing software that's going to be heading in that direction for sure.
But also it will be disruptive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Daniela, your hand up too?
Yeah, just to kind of dovetail, I mean, I like the last comment about sort of the disruptive technologies that came online. But I remember in the 90s, for instance, where some computational tools were coming up, there was like this huge, like some offices literally refused to adopt those tools because they claimed it's more original to draw by hand. And there were crazy arguments about like these tools replacing designers and architects, and those are the same conversations that are going on right now. And it's a little comical to think, you know, that these AI images that are being produced based on prompts are going to replace practitioners that are practicing spatially. However, I think it's important to adopt those tools, and it's important to use them because they, like you said, there are affordances. There are things that you can do faster and better. They have kind of like superpowers, let's say. But there's always like kind of a suspicion that like architecture is being contaminated by like a new disruptive tool. But I think it takes a while, and pretty soon AI is just going to be integrated into processes just like BIM, just like Rhino, just like every other technology that we have. But I think it's very interesting that we always default to kind of a suspicious mode, like, oh no, now we're going to be replaced by this technology. Now our profession is no longer going to exist. And I see these conversations, especially like on social media, where all the conversations about these new AI tools happening all the time. These issues are raised over and over again. But to dovetail that into an earlier question that I asked, if you could please just discuss, maybe broadly refer to some researchers that are really looking deeply into kind of three-dimensionalizing the kinds of images that we see. I was talking to Nicholas Piska, who's one of the best design technologists that I know. And he basically said, you know, we really have to get into coding. I mean, there's the idea that we're going to just kind of figure out a way to three-dimensionalize these AI images is just, you know, we really have to get under the hood and start to code. We can't just kind of take what like a certain model that was trained in a certain way spits out and expect to kind of convert that into architecture.
Yeah, Nick is fantastic. I used to teach with him, and he's really amazing. He used to work for Gary Technologies, and one of the great geniuses. But the big question, of course, is, and I had a discussion with him about Grasshopper, which he thinks he's kind of, as a system, is just not robust enough, and he can do the coding and so on. But there's always this kind of question about which direction we're going in. Is it becoming easier? Like, you know, certain features of the iPhone, you swipe it and so on, and it gets easier. Or do we need to really know about all these things? And it's a debate that maybe we'll come up with when we get to the the session that's involving Randy Deutsch, who has a book called Super Users, where he believes we will all become these super users, which will be really good at certain coding. But at the same time, I mean, I think what's happening now is that actually through MidJourney, we're avoiding certain sort of technological kind of issues. And I don't know. I think there the 3D issue is a big one. There's PyTorch 3D was being developed, but it wasn't so successful. I think is kind of clearly an issue. But what I would say is, in the sense that we as architects have always been operating two-dimensionally. I mean, a plan section elevation is a two-dimensional drawing. So we've always been operating in a two-dimensional way. Yeah. Okay. Daniel, you got your hand up for another one, Danielle? You've your hand still up.
Yeah, I think it's still up.
Okay. Kathleen, do you want to ask the question?
No, I think Dipti had a question. I don't know. I saw her hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. I just had a comment to add to what Samir was saying. Like, I think right now it's very crucial, because if anybody is looking at these technologies of fabrication and BIM, etc., they should definitely keep an eye out for metaverse and digital twins. With Omniverse NVIDIA, they've created a complete digital twin of BMW, and they are simulating digitally what is happening with the robots in BMW on the digital twin in the metaverse. So it's already happening. This software integration that's there on Omniverse is just crazy. You can kind of integrate softwares from Maya, BIM, Rhino, everything. All softwares can be integrated, and whatever changes you make on this Omniverse, NVIDIA Omniverse, will be updated on your actual design. And you can also simulate how the robotic construction of that design can take place entirely on the digital twin. And then all you need to do is just download that simulation that you've already trained the fabrication model with, and it will start, the robot can then, in whichever area it is, it can then start fabricating that. So I think, yeah, just wanted to add to what someone was saying.
Yeah, the digital twin is something it's actually relatively new to that, but having a huge impact. They're using it for modeling environmental control systems in buildings already. But the one I find interesting is the one that's been developed by Alibaba in China, which is called City Brain, and they have a digital twin of a city where in real time you're monitoring things like traffic and so on, and then they're using the computational power of the computer to basically solve traffic problems. So that's a kind of very realistic kind of application of AI. Daniela, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to jump in here into the conversation of digital twins and the metaverse in general. Like, I think right now, what we're seeing is kind of like, if you will, a divided market of metaverses. So on the one hand, you have these digital twins that are tracking and collecting data and monitoring things. And then you have metaverses that are really being used as sandboxes for future possibilities. And I'm involved in one of those, Liberland Metaverse. And then there are extremely fantastical metaverses where people are just kind of imagining things that will never exist, and want to engage in things that, we can't do, like anti-gravity, etc. But what's really interesting is that there's kind of like a blending of all three of those models right now. Like each metaverse that is coming up right now, the metaverses that are in Unreal Engine, like Wilderworld, like Liberland Metaverse, there are a few others. They're kind of blending them, like they're, like for instance, Wilderworld is partnering with Miami and creating a city called Wyami in the metaverse. It's not a digital twin. It's a fantastical place, and Wilderworld is much more fantastical than realistic. However, as real projects begin to come into that metaverse, I think it will gradually kind of move towards kind of a middle ground where it becomes much more realistic, much more enterprise oriented. And in the same way, metaverses that are extremely like digital twin-like are starting to see like there's a possibility to integrate more fantastical elements. So I think it's very interesting what's emerging. metaverses are also much earlier than AI, I think, in the conversation. But I find this conversation very interesting about the metaverse and how AI is going to play into it.
Yeah, I guess you're referring to Mariana Cabocera in terms of Wilder. I mean, and she's going to be on, we're having a session on the metaverse in Digital Futures in a few weeks' time, so she'll be there.
Yeah, but she's relatively new to that. We have to understand, like, Wilder World has been going since 2017. They've been planning, I believe. And a lot of their systems and a lot of their underlying technology called Zero has been emerging. And Mariana is sort of like actualizing the design, but not necessarily like the whole platform logistics. But one thing that they do is they create a lot of FOMO by dropping a lot of NFTs, things that you might be able to use in the metaverse in the future, like vehicles and animals and all kinds of things. But you can't actually step into their metaverse yet. All we've seen are like pictures. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the experience actually is when we are able to go into an MMO platform. Because in my experience, you have to kind of reduce the complexities of things that you're doing, not just geometries, but all kinds of things in order to make it operational. So as we're designing, we're kind of flying the plane as we build it. As we're designing things and as we're instantiating them, technologies are coming online, and occasionally everything kind of shifts and you're able to do things you weren't able to do 2 months ago. So it's an interesting developmental thing.
No, we're definitely flying the plane as we build it, that's for sure. There's a question in the chat which I want to put to the whole whole audience. It's from, I hope I got this name right, Baran Purtamaseb Sasi. I'm sure I got that wrong. Who's not an architect. Where does the panel see the direction of AI development with implications of the greater global arena in terms of economic development and political influence? As a political science major, I'm more interested in the implications of AI beyond how it is used in design, schematics, and paintings, and then not just a social construct, but how it influences human interactions and creates a new hierarchy. Well, you know, actually, that is the bigger question. I think we're marginalized as architects. We're just looking at this very small aspect of you know, machine vision. I think there was a response earlier on that I forget who it was now making. I think maybe it was DT was making a comment about alpha, about DeepMind and how they're developing into the kind of science arena. I mean, I think that I mean, just to respond to Baran, I mean, I think that it probably will have much more impact actually in other arenas than it will in architecture. And it's, I guess the comment was made back in 2002, and I'm blanking on who's the Microsoft guy? Sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, he made this comment. He said by the end of the decade, there's nothing that will be untouched by the digital, and that was in kind of 2002. He made that comment, and by 2010, it was clear that was the case. And I think you could make the same. I think we are in the AI decade, and I would say by the end of the decade, I don't know what is not going to be touched by this. And it seems like it's there as a tool that can be deployed in many places, and probably the visual domain is probably the least effective of what it's been used. So I'm not in a position to answer that. I don't know if anyone in the audience here wants to respond, but it seemed to me that it can be employed in any different arena, and probably in others more so than architecture. Any comments? David, do you want to ask your question or make your point?
Sure, maybe a little bit related. And coming from somebody who's very new to thinking about AI topics, I'm interested in this moment that we're talking about, or the way that we're early and things are developing. For me, I guess as I get acquainted, the idea of prompt engineering and the reference instead of samples makes me think about democratic possibilities with AI and AI in design. So for example, since I've now understand that people are constantly prompting visuals of women. One of the things that's like most asked for in AI. You know, if you are prompting something like beautiful woman, and a Eurocentric idea of what beauty is part of that. So for example, I don't know, blonde hair, blue-eyed women are going to come up, and that gets generated and then reified within this system. I'm just wondering how we sort of kind of break out of that and get more inclusive data sets early. And I don't know if, as somebody who's new to this, if the earliness matters. It sort of seems like it does to me. Like if we're generating these systems, we want more diverse prompts earlier to not create something that's so insular to the kinds of communities we are as relatively privileged thinkers within architecture and AI. I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody, but that's where my mind usually goes, and count myself as part of that. But I'm just wondering, like, how urgent is it? Does it feel urgent to others? Am I wrong? Like, what could this mean? And I guess more directly related to the example that I'm thinking about with architecture is, like, I love Zaha Hadid as well, very inspirational. I think really excellent things, but I'm also quite taken with Freddie Mamani, who I feel like does not get as much visual space. And I'm not even really interested in any particular designer or look, but he seems like a great example of something that would be very visually generative, but probably isn't coming up as often in some of these visual experimentations with designers. So that's sort of where my mind is going. Are we creating something that's going to be really hard to dismantle later? And I know that I sound like the paranoid person we've been talking about, where it's going to take over. And I don't actually mean it that way, but just kind of thinking about, at this juncture, are we losing sight of how to make sure it's as holistic, as democratic as possible?
I mean, I think you're touching on a very important issue there, David. I think the whole issue of bias in AI has become an enormous issue. I mean, the problem, of course, though, is the bias comes from us, you know, and I think that ultimately, I mean, there are some, I think the African-American faces don't appear don't appear so often, and so on and so on. And they're also, and I don't go into details, but certain ethnicities are associated with certain activities. Very, very unfortunate things that are coming out of the computer. It's a reflection of social bias in many ways. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I think people tend to sort of. There's a book, that the Atlas of AI, that's very negative about these things and pointing this out and so on. I don't know. The thing is, I personally see it as a tool, and we could recalibrate the tool in some ways. But you're right in terms of kind of we're just getting a reflection of our own biases out there. I can see that Agnieszka wanted to make a comment on the chat. Do you want to respond to David in a way, Agnieszka?
No, I just made a comment that I agree with the point. I think it's really important, and it is. I also think the great point is what you just said. The bias comes from us, but it's still not a great way to evaluate those tools. I think it's a problem we have to deal right now, quite fast, actually.
Yeah, it's going to get reinforced by that. I mean, the question about so I'm just blanking on the name of the architect that Aaron Hartzman used. It was this French architect that we actually interviewed in Digital Futures for the in the Legend series. Maybe Baveline remembers the name. Odile Deck, yeah, Odile Deck. Odile Deck, I mean, it was kind of, I mean, anyone knows Odile Deck's work. She's kind of dressed like a goth. She's really striking appearance, and her buildings are striking. They're colorful, they're dynamic. And when he input her name, he got this kind of straightforward sort of rectilinear building, which is quite unlike what she would produce in some ways. And the problem is it would then reinforce existing things. So, you know, Zaha gets more replicated because there's more Zaha out there. So I could see that there is that problem will reinforce it, because then the generated material coming out of MidJourney will then form the database for the next generation. So it's going to be kind of a it's going to be exacerbating the whole situation. We should try and wrap up soon. I don't know whether Felice, you'd like to make a comment in the chat here, or
Hi, Neil. You basically summarized what, as I was typing that comment, you summarized it, but I wasn't sure, and I think you answered the question, which is that there's recursion within the data set. So the more these prompts are used, the more the data set gets robust within its own biases. So, I mean, in other words, we talked about this idea of like, where the legalities, and all kinds of possible new avenues for practice. One of those practices would have to be the kind of maybe recalibration of data sets in general, taking into account what David mentioned. And I think that will be an emergent sort of system of agency, I'm hoping anyway, within the how AI can get more democratized. But, I had this issue actually even within architecture, which was mentioned also by David, which, I prompted Super Studio, which I thought would actually get a lot, of imagery, and nothing came up. So, it happens even within our very practice. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there are, I mean, you soon find out the limits of certain terms. And DALL-E, of course, bans certain words. I tried using Salvador Dali's comment that the future of architecture will be soft and hairy is a banned word in DALL-E. So yeah, no, but recursion, that's exactly the word I was looking for. I think one thing I would say is, in terms of tools, I mean, what I find interesting is that, you're seeing history in the making right now, which is kind of interesting. And when you make a tool, you don't know how it's going to be used. I mean, I think that the cell phone was, originally they thought it was going to be for rich businessmen, but actually when it was the rich businessmen gave it to their daughters when they're going out and said, give me a call, I'll come and pick you up. That's when it sort of changed and shift. And that's the thing I think I'm looking forward to see the unpredictable practices that will emerge out of this arena. I just sort of thought, going back to what David was saying in some ways, and in a way, we are just seeing things as they happen. I'm just wondering, and I'm just thinking because David's got a background in critical theory, and I was wondering about what I was struck by when I was producing a book called Rethinking Architecture was how some of the early commentators about modernity, people like Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Krakauer and Jörg Simmel, had an incredibly insightful view about what was happening. And they could really get to the heart of things right now, and in a way that we somehow can't. So maybe we've got a very privileged view, we can see these things. But one thing I also thought about Walter Benjamin, which I thought was an interesting kind of comment, is he starts, we were talking about photography, and Benjamin was totally obsessed with the question about photography and the loss of aura of the artwork and all these kind of questions. So he's fundamental. But one of the interesting things I found in Benjamin is that the language of photography begins to infiltrate his own language. So we see things in terms of the snapshot, and he has a whole repertoire of words that come out of photography. And I'm wondering to what extent that our lexicon will itself be conditioned. I mean, I'm sure the word prompt is going to be completely different in years to come, but how our way of thinking is also changing. So on one hand, you have the prediction about how a tool will be used, but then, I guess it goes down to that sort of comment that's attributed to Winston Churchill: we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. We could use that for tools. We produce our tools, thereafter they produce us. And to what extent there will be something that will feed into our way of operating will change because of that. So there's a comment in the chat came from Baron. One of the things the panel is kind of bringing up over and over again is the democratization of this technology, which of course is the bigger scheme of things implies that everyone has access to it. Can we get personalized education coaching with AI? How far are we off from that? Well, Baron, you're absolutely right. There is a digital divide. First of all, it costs money to go on to use MidJourney. If you use it more than if you use it a lot, you need to pay for that. And of course, for some people, it's going to be prohibitive. I can absolutely accept that. And it's I think it's absolutely important. Having said all that, this is precisely. Actually, the third question comes from someone called Persona. Can we get personalized education coaching with AI? How far are we off from that? Well, putting those two together, one of the aims of Digital Futures is precisely that, the idea that somehow we can help to democratize education by making these tools available for free. This goes back to a moment in the background of the history of Digital Futures with the pandemic. This was we had been meeting in person for a summer event, and we went online and we went digital. And the point is, it wasn't just simply we realized we could break through the physical walls of the classroom. We could actually break through the social, economic, and political barriers and bring these ideas to everyone throughout the world. So that's why I think in some ways why we're trying to use this platform to share ideas and to share them for free, because Baron's right. It's, of course, people don't always have access to this, and frankly, they don't even have access in certain areas of the world to high broadband internet. You know, I think that there is a problem there. Yeah.
Can I just jump in for a second? I just want to go back to the issue about sort of the bias of the AI. And when I presented a few weeks ago, I called my presentation Black Box Wunderkammer, because we forget that there is a black box aspect to AI. And so I have a little anecdote. This comes from an article interview with David Holtz, the founder of MidJourney. And he talks about this woman that the model keeps generating, and they actually view it more like as a little problem or like a glitch. They actually call her MidJourney, and she's very identifiable. Like if you look at a lot of images of the women on there, you will start to identify this woman. They have no idea which database it came from. They use 12 databases for training, but she just kind of keeps popping up. And the same thing with like when you give MidJourney unspecific directions about color, for instance, it really gives a lot of like blues and oranges. And again, they don't exactly know why that is, but it's kind of the black box aspect of AI. And I think that's when people start to discuss how scary AI is, that's usually what they're referring to, like, oh no, we trained something that we're going to lose complete control over. And depending on how you deploy these tools, that could be very true. So I wonder if you can address this issue, like the black box aspect of training an AI model and then really not really completely understanding how it works after it's, active.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking, I was reminded of the famous incident that happened about 3 years ago. I think maybe it was 4 years ago. I forget exactly, when there were 2 AI bots that started developing their own language. I forget who was developing this.
Facebook.
Facebook, right? And there was, people are terrified. Oh my God, they're having discussions that this is ridiculous. And we won't understand it, and they're gonna take over. But actually, that was a misunderstanding. It was simply a glitch in the software in the first place. But they couldn't have a conversation. It just doesn't make any sense just yet. They're not able to have that. They're not thinking agents, therefore that wouldn't. So I think there's a lot of fear mongering going out there about this thing. I wouldn't be too worried myself about that. I mean, for sure, I've noticed this myself, and I assumed, I mean, this thing about colors was, I've noticed exactly that question. I would produce these 2 complete different projects. One was about the Aurora Borealis, which is basically green and red, and one was about sunsets, and they all ended up coming out the same way. And I'm curious about that. There is this concept of overfitting, which I'm not an expert on, but I think that's probably the way to understand why a particular face kind of keeps repeating itself. I don't know if anyone's able to comment on the overfitting question.
Yeah, maybe the overfitting issue is like when we have so many repeated data samples, or we don't have much diversity, and the machine tends to learn specific features. So that's a kind of biased thing. But that's a challenge to, how we can balance data sets to train models that represent reality in its whole term, in its wider sense. But we have also the overfitting issue and the underfitting issue. It's like you have so few data samples that the machine does not learn properly. That's the only thing I think I can add.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one of the problems, you notice when I showed the style GANs, those faces, I mean, I really recommend somebody go into that "this person does not exist" site, because some of those are just stunning. They really are amazing. But when you're training it using a GAN on people, it is more accurate. The trouble about these massive pre-trained things is that they're really bad at hands and faces, and things that actually StyleGANs is quite good at. And I'm just wondering, maybe it's because of that. I don't know that it's coming up with this overfitting kind of generalized face. I've certainly noticed it. Much of the time you get really bad faces appearing. And I did one once, and I was trying to. One of my colleagues had been to the Soane Museum in London and had come across these Hogarth paintings and said, "Oh my God, this William Hogarth, it looks like it's kind of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson." There's this kind of scenario. So I tried to get a kind of a view of Boris Johnson. They wouldn't allow me to do that because DALL-E won't let you put names in. So I put in a kind of British Prime Minister with unkempt hair in the style of William Hogarth. And it produced this astonishing face. It was really very, very realistic. And I'm sure it was one of those overfitting kind of standardized faces that has somehow been adopted by the system. So, it is an issue. And the other thing I'd say, and maybe I'll show it at some point, that I noticed that there seems to be something, and I'd assumed it was written into the MidJourney logic, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's something coming out of that. And maybe there's something that is completely unpredictable. I think that Daniela's comment was really interesting about, I'd love to see that reference to that article about where they were discussing these things. But I noticed that there's a standard format that gets repeated over and over again, that I see there is an aesthetic, and I don't know why that is. And I'm sure and I assumed it was written into there, maybe to help a certain prompt or something, but I'm now beginning to realize that maybe it's not. And so I'd be fascinated to know more about these things. Agnieszka.
I just wanted to add, because we were talking about bias and repeating the patterns in some of the AI tools, and it just popped to my mind how oftenly I use mostly MidJourney. So how often MidJourney creates something like those cross patterns. And I think it's really interesting because sometimes I find architects who start using MidJourney, and with the first of their creations, you can see their style. I mean, they're prompting something which is theirs, which is familiar to them. So it looks like it is their style, but with some more and more prompts, more and more usage of this tool, it gets more and more standards to MidJourney, standards to this AI tool, because they are using more general prompts. And for example, this grid happens, and this standard like flow, or I think also Zaha Hadid is so popular prompt that it's starting to get everywhere with architecture prompting. So it just popped in my mind to comment on that it's another thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Samir, we should try and wrap things up, but Samir, great. Do you want to ask your question?
It will be a very short comment, but just catching up from Agnieszka, I think the really added value in AI is the impossible scenarios. I have been experimenting of having a hybrid kind of style between the Gaudism or Antonio Gaudi and Zaha Hadid. And it was a very interesting, some kind of a biomorphic lines, but done by Zaha Hadid. And then the new project started just for fun, but it turned out to be something so much valuable, which is the flavor of food. So I've been experimenting with the falafel, which is a very cultural known food, and then the cotton candy and whatever you can imagine, but done by Zaha Hadid and Antonio Gaudi. And it was very interesting having a kind of architecture that you can taste. Thank you.
So yeah, I've done the same, I've got to say. And I think that's where it gets interesting, right? I mean, if you're just asking it to replicate what you already know, it's going to be, but if you start, and I see this as a kind of like a grit in the oyster that produces the pearl, right? You put something in there, and I always put something in that's completely not architectural. It's usually some kind of creature like a shark or something or whatever, and it has that effect of taking it out into a different arena that's super interesting. No, I think I completely agree. That's the experimentation. Anyway, I think we're seeing something that is super interesting. I think we should try and wrap things up now. We've been going for 2.5 hours, and also we want to save some of the discussion for the weeks to come. I just want to thank everyone for being part of this session. Also, the background team behind this from Digital Futures who've been working so hard to promote this all selflessly. It's great to know that this is going around the world. It's great to have people like Harith here from Baghdad, and Samir from Beirut, and Guy from Italy, and so on. It's and Agnieszka from Poland, and Ricardo from Brazil, and whatever. It's great to have this debate going, and let's see where it goes to. I think that, you know, I don't know, maybe by the end of this of the series, we'll come to this point where the whole debate has been changing. And I think absolutely that what's happening now, in a way, and this is why I wanted to go back to the question about what is AI, because I thought I knew what AI was, but there are things that are coming up that are being thrown up by this that are really new and are really prompting us to really rethink not just what AI is, but what it is to be human. And I think that's the most important aspect in some ways, is to, I think anyway, to see AI as a mirror in which it is to be human. That's not to say it's the same thing. We're not saying we see ourselves exactly in this AI, but rather we see the differences, and it begins to kind of point towards something new. But anyway, thank you for this debate. We're going to upload this to the YouTube channel, and I hope that you'll come and join us again. Let's see, you know, it is history in the making, and I think the experimentation that's going on now, especially by those who are either students who are working with this, or indeed teaching, or indeed using it in the the architectural office, something new is appearing. I don't know quite what it is, and but something new is happening. So next week, we're going to be looking at I wanted to look about why this is such an important sort of moment, and why I call it the AI spring. I'll explain all that. I want to look back at the history on how AI has been happening over the time, and then also project into the future some of the ideas about what will be the future of AI. And I want to bring in some other examples of work, because some of the work that is literally produced on a day-by-day basis on Instagram is super important. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week, and let's see how the discussion progresses. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the team behind all this. So and just to remind you that we have a Digital Futures call, Digital Futures Young call for all these tools coming up, these diffusion models coming up. Okay, so see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.